Ruth 1:10 through 14 continues Naomi's conversation with her daughters-in-law from the previous verses, Ruth 1:6 through 9. In this section, she continues trying to persuade Orpah and Ruth to return to their own families. Before we begin, make sure you download the worksheet, read the passage several times, and make your own observations, and then watch the rest of this video or read the blog post and compare your notes. All right, let's dive in. We'll begin by reading the passage. And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. We'll begin our study with Ruth 1, verse 10. In the previous verses, Naomi encouraged her daughters-in-law to return to their mother's houses. Sadly, Naomi knew that Orpah and Ruth would likely remain widows the rest of their lives if they continued to live with her. So their reply comes after they wept together. Word placement in Hebrew can emphasize a point. In English, we translate verse 10 as saying, "We will return with you." In Hebrew, however, it reads more like this, "With you, we will return." So the structure of this sentence actually emphasizes the focus on Naomi. In these first 10 verses, Naomi is the central character. The tragedy is all focused on her. When Orpah and Ruth choose to return with Naomi, they choose to adopt her people. Until this point, Naomi lived in their country, Moab. But if the women returned to Judah, however, the situation would be reversed. Orpah and Ruth would be living in a foreign land. They choose this fate by acknowledging they will be with Naomi's people. Ruth 1, verse 11. But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should ye go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" Naomi repeats her instructions from verse 8, where she told them to return already. The first time she tried to send them away with a blessing. This time, she enters into a series of rhetorical questions that highlights just how tragic her situation is. Her first question to them plays on the fact that Naomi is beyond an age when she could get pregnant. Since the question is rhetorical, Naomi clearly thinks her appearance makes this fact obvious. The idea that Naomi would somehow provide more husbands for Orpah and Ruth is based on a custom that we see in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, describes the process by which a man would marry his brother's widow to ensure the dead man's family line continued. Naomi's question makes it clear that this is not an option for Orpah and Ruth. We can read this in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. "When brothers live together, and one of them dies, and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall have relations with her and take her to himself as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her." So this whole idea of who is going to take care of the obligation of the brother is a major factor in the book of Ruth, and one we will come back to several times throughout the story. Ruth 1, verse 12 says, "Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I were even to have a husband tonight and also give births to sons." Now, this verse continues on into verse 13, but we'll pause here. Naomi repeats her instructions for a third time. She wants the women to return to their mother's houses. This time she adds an additional command, "Go." Now, while she used rhetorical questions in the previous verses, Naomi makes her thoughts clear in verse 12. She explains that she is too old to have a husband. The Hebrew makes it even more explicit than what is captured in the English. She describes herself as too old to be with a man. So the idea here is clearly if she were to be able to get pregnant tonight, that would be a difficult thing. Finally, Naomi sets up a hypothetical situation that continues into the next verse, but she frames it with three huge ifs. If she could find a man, if she could get pregnant, and if the children were boys. This whole sequence of ifs illustrates how absurd it would be for Orpah and Ruth to remain with Naomi. There is, in Naomi's mind, no hope for her. Therefore, there is no hope for her daughters-in-law if they stay with her. Ruth 1 verse 13 continues the conversation. To this point in her response to the women, Naomi has focused on the impossibility of her having more sons. And you can see this by the frequency that she talks about herself in the first several verses of our passage for today. In verse 13, however, Naomi turns her attention to the effects this would have on Orpah and Ruth. Her rhetorical questions emphasize the point that the two women would have to wait a long time before they could marry these hypothetical sons that Naomi might have. In the meantime, they would be missing out on life by not marrying another man. After pointing out the absurdity of continuing with her, Naomi finally gets to the point. This whole tragic situation is too bitter a pill for Naomi to swallow. In a few verses, the word for bitter will appear again when Naomi tries to change her name. Why is Naomi bitter? Well, she explains, it's because the hand of the Lord has come out against me. While modern Western Christians tend to rationalize events in life, ancient Israelites viewed everything as coming from God. Consequently, Naomi viewed the loss of her husband and her sons as an act done by the hand of God. The phrase the hand of God was frequently used to refer to the idea of God striking people or animals with death. The same imagery appears in Exodus 9, verse 3, where it says, "Behold, the hand of the Lord will come with a very severe plague on your livestock, which are in the field, on the horses, on the donkeys, on the camels, on the herds, and on the flocks." We see the same thing in 1 Samuel 5, verses 6 and 9. Now the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he made them feel devastated and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territories. And then again in verse 9, after they had taken it away, the hand of the Lord was against the city, creating a very great panic. And he struck the people of the city, from the young to the old, so that tumors broke out onto them. Ruth 1 verse 14. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. After Naomi finishes her speech, the women weep again. This is the second time they have cried after Naomi speaks. In this way, the narrator emphasizes the tragedy. Naomi speaks, the women cry. Naomi speaks, the women cry. Until this point in the story, Orpah and Ruth were treated as one, but now they are treated separately. The narrator even refers to them in the plural at almost every point. For example, Naomi speaks to both of them, and they both reply. Even when Naomi's sons marry the women, we don't know which woman is married to which man. Ruth 1 verse 4 just says, they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. So there's just this communal unity idea with Naomi and Ruth. They are a collection all the way through these opening verses. This completely changes, however, in Ruth 1 verse 14. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, which indicates that she will be leaving. The conjunction but, however, draws a sharp contrast between Orpah and Ruth. Ruth clings to Naomi. The Hebrew word used for cling is the same word used in Genesis 2 verse 24. It carries the idea of creating a new family. This is often done in the context of a husband and wife relationship. For Ruth, however, it means that she will leave behind the safety of her mother's house and join her mother-in-law's. Consequently, Ruth's fate is tied to Naomi's from this point forward. The two women will rise or fall together. Ruth 1, 10 through 14 represents Naomi's final attempt to convince her daughters-in-law to pursue a better life with their families. She successfully convinces Orpah to leave. Ruth, on the other hand, decides she will continue on with Naomi. If we remember the meaning of their names, and you can see the video on Ruth 1 verses 1 through 5, their actions make sense. They're already foreshadowed. Orpah's name means back of the neck. This image is what you get when you imagine Orpah leaving Naomi to return to her own people. Naomi would see the back of Orpah's neck. Ruth's name, on the other hand, means to be satisfied. As we return our attention to the next section of the story and the rest of the book, this will be an important question. How will Ruth and Naomi be satisfied in the wake of such terrible, terrible tragedies? If you like this content, make sure you subscribe to the channel and follow along with the series as we work our way through the book of Ruth.